Welcome to Tax and Confused, the podcast where tax administration meets real talk. We are your hosts, Lizzie and Lisa, two tax nerds on a mission to decode the rules, demystify the system, and maybe even make you laugh along the way. From tax returns to objections and everything in between, we're diving into the world where the burden of proof is on you, not the ATO. That's right, this isn't criminal law. In tax, you are guilty until proven compliant. But just a quick heads up, this podcast is for educational purposes only. It's not tax advice, and it's definitely not a suitable substitute for professional guidance tailored to your situation. So brace for bureaucracy and join us as we explore the weird, the wonky, and the wildly important world of tax admin. Because when it comes to tax, we're all a little taxed and confused. So Lisa, in this episode, we are going to explore the kinds of advice and guidance that the Australian Taxation Office, aka ATO, publishes. So not everything is equal here, is it, Lisa?
Not at all. And I was thinking about all the topics we've done so far. This is probably a fairly dry, but we'll try and make it still in our own little way as entertaining as possible. So yeah, we're basically looking at the ATO's sort of dual role, aren't we, Lizzie, with this? We're sort of saying, yeah, they collect tax. That's what they do. But remember, they're the administrator of the tax law. And, you know, we've got all our assessment acts and our admin acts and everything like that. And we've got all the case law. So it's all about interpretation. So the ATO do their job at interpreting what their position is. Because if we disagree with their position, of course, we're going to take it through the court system, either administrative or judicial, which we've already talked about in previous episodes. And that's how it's all going to come about. So the ATO have a position to say, really, do this, nothing to see here. Or if you don't do this, where are you going to end up, sort of thing. You could end up at the High Court. Who knows?
Yeah, because there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of complexity in tax law. It's a very difficult area to make sense of. So when an everyday taxpayer needs to be compliant, there's a lot of support that they can get, whether it's a registered tax practitioner, but the ATO themselves are there to also provide assistance, and they do that through providing their interpretation of how the law ought to be interpreted. And obviously that's distinct from the law itself. So we have legislation, we have cases going through the courts that essentially establish principles that we can take in how we interpret. But ultimately, the ATO needs to administer and deal with the fact that there's a lot of grey area in doing that. So, you know, there's a lot more that the ATO does in this space. So, Lisa, what are the ways in which the Commissioner actually assists taxpayers here?
Well, yeah, if you look at the really basics, you know, if you're a tax agent or something like that, you can just jump on the phone and say, hey, what do you think about this, based on hopefully getting to the right department? And that's a bit ad hoc, you know, how do I do this? How do I do that? Now, you know, from my point of view, I would only do that if it's purely process administrative in that true sense of the word. You know, can I send this through the portal, you know, through Practice Mail, or can I, you know, what is it for safety and reasons like that? But of course, they also produce this plethora of different types of advice called all different things that confuse everyone on what they're doing. You know, the basic thing is picking up the phone and giving them a call, and that's tax agent or taxpayer. I'll just clarify that. But you've also got their website, and you know, there's all these tools on the website, and then they've got the ruling system. And the ruling system can be for everyone or for a specific taxpayer. And depending on can I use the word vehicle? Whatever vehicle they use, what sort of publication it is, depends on how much the taxpayer can rely on it as well.
And that's probably a really important distinction right there and there. There's different publications that the Commission or the ATO produces that taxpayers can rely on, but who can rely on it, in what circumstance that can be relied on, will definitely vary. And that can offer taxpayers that can rely on this information or advice coming through, that can protect those taxpayers in different ways as well. So we've got to be really careful in understanding the nuances between these different kinds of products that are being released. So if we think firstly about there's the website, which includes web guidance, that doesn't actually give us as much security or protection in a sense, or certainty as other kinds of advice. So what are the main types of advice and guidance that the ATO provides, perhaps, that have a little bit more weight to them?
Yeah, so we've got probably the most common one people talk about is the rulings. The ATO make a ruling on a specific transaction, event, or whatever. And there's two different pathways for these rulings, and that's the public one. So the ATO will say, here's a tax ruling or on income tax, GST or whatever, and says, this is our interpretation of it, right? And it applies to all taxpayers, right? And then we call them private binding rulings, but they're really just private rulings that'll get issued to one specific taxpayer for a specific transaction for a specific year, right? So they're the two ones. So the ones that you and I would look up, that we sort of rely on a lot more, of these general ones, these tax rulings, these public rulings. And we look and go, and they're quite detailed, and some of them are absolutely fantastic, and we use them for teaching aids and things like that as well, because they go through in a lot of detail.
And such, often with,
Exactly.
what looks like that, because it's generally covering a particular fact or circumstance. So if you're a taxpayer that is within scope of that, you can look to essentially the guidance that's within that ruling to say, this is how I should interpret it if I'm essentially going to follow the interpretation of the ATO.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about those, it's binding on the ATO. Okay, so they've put it out. It's called a tax ruling. If you follow it, in effect, you're safe as houses, right? You're not going to get pinged for any shape or form. If you get questioned by an audit, you go, well, I followed this TR, date / number, and you go from there. So that's binding on everyone and the ATO. So you follow it, you're safe. You won't get in trouble for audit. You won't get interest or penalties or anything like that if you don't follow it and things like that. Okay.
If though, I just want to provide a caveat there. If your facts and circumstances don't fit within the scope of that, if you've got a distinguishing factor, though, that may then put you outside of the relevance of that ruling as well.
So the important thing is to look at the facts, Lizzie. Exactly. You look at the facts and tick them off and say, yep, that applies to me 100%, and then you're relying on it. But then we look at the private ruling, and the taxpayer applies for that, either themselves or through a tax lawyer or a tax agent, and we put through and say, for this tax year, here are my facts. ATO, make a decision on how you're going to interpret it.
So it might be, for example, if you're selling a whole bunch of stamps and you want clarity on whether that stamp collection activity amounts to a hobby or a business, and the ATO will say yes, no, and provide explanation about why they've come to that conclusion.
And it gives you their position on what it is. So that's then binding on them, exactly the same as the public ruling is. But you've got to make sure, because usually you ask for it before you've done something, so you've got to make sure you know exactly how the transaction's going to work, or what you're going to sell, or what's going on. Because if you deviate a little bit from it, you lose your protection. Okay? And the thing is as well, you're allowed to deviate from it. You don't have to. Remember, it's binding on the commissioner. It's not binding on the taxpayer. So if you change if you don't get something favourable, you could change the fact pattern slightly because it hasn't happened yet. And then you can go, well, I believe this is my position.
But obviously in doing that, you would then, the ATO might perceive whatever you submit, that might trigger perhaps some audit activity. So obviously you're going to be on the radar. So you've got to contemplate those changes and deviations as to whether the primary purpose is that tax advantage or not. So being
Correct.
ethical in that process. But it is quite interesting because these private binding rulings are often then published, anonymized, but published on the ATO website, which creates some interesting circumstances because it's a document relating to a taxpayer and the commissioner. It's anonymized, it's kind of cleaned out of a lot of detail that would potentially identify the taxpayer. So the facts are often more limited. There's not as much information to contextualize what's going on. But we then have this question about, okay, well, this is then indicating how the ATO may interpret a certain fact pattern, but we've got to be clear that the ATO is very explicit in saying that these private binding rulings cannot be used as precedent. They cannot be used by other taxpayers that aren't privy to that particular private binding ruling. They can't rely on that for their own circumstances.
No.
So they don't operate to have that broad applicability like the public rulings do. So there's a lot of caution there. So it's kind of counterintuitive because you can get a lot of interesting fact patterns, see what the outcomes were, and that can be really, in a sense, quite useful. But we've got to be really clear that they are not able to be used as precedent when it comes to interpreting and supporting a particular fact pattern of someone else. That's a really important circumstance that needs to be well understood.
Yeah, and to reinforce that, you can't use it like you would a case that's gone through the court system, right? That's what you mean by precedence, right? You can't use it as support like a case, but it gives you a bit of a flavour and a vibe. And we look at it and going, oh, yeah, there might be a theme. You know, like a few years ago, there was a lot of crypto ones. You know, a lot of property transaction ones. There's a lot of things going, oh, it gives you some indication about where there could be potential uncertainty that someone's gone. Then the other thing is with private binding rulings is, do you want to go ahead and show your cards to the ATO as well? Do you actually want to submit one and potentially, as you said, raise a red flag for audit?
And the other thing to think about is that they can be quite costly to prepare. So to go seeking that tax practitioner or tax lawyer preparing that documentation, it can be really important and your circumstances may warrant it. So it's about getting the proper advice and looking at the options. So not everyone would choose to go down a private binding ruling pathway, but certainly there's plenty that do because of the certainty or the uncertainty that they are experiencing. And then it could be because of the significance of the dollars that are impacted there.
Exactly. It's all about managing the risk. And the other thing that people have to be aware about is the time frame that the ATO is to get the decision back to you, because you do it for a specific income tax year for a specific transaction. Okay, so a little while ago they were taking 9 months or something to come back to you. Right, so you go, well, that's not going to be very helpful to me. So you've got to allow for that in the time frame as well. But when we ask the ATO any questions, we're managing risk. Okay, we're going to apply the black letter law for really things that are easy, but these are the things that have got more uncertainty about it, and it's all about managing the risk. And the client will come to me, hey Lisa, what's the position here? And I said, well, I'm giving you 3 options. How they could interpret it. Let's talk it through more and see if we can get more fact pattern about it to get more certainty. But sometimes you've got to make the call. Okay, and that's what it's about. It's about managing your risk.
Yeah. And there can be other circumstances. So moving back into more of a public ruling or like a ruling that applies to a group of taxpayers, there can be class rulings where there might have been a certain transaction or event that happens, and a class ruling is then applied for and produced so that all of those taxpayers within that certain circumstance can get clarity. So often this might be be for a in specie or a return of capital type event, some kind of share event that's occurred. And so the company will seek clarity to get a class ruling that covers off on all the taxpayers that are essentially shareholders of that particular company. So they know exactly how to deal with the disposal, what bit is revenue as a dividend versus capital gain or loss, and what kind of event it is. And so again, creates clarity, but very specific. You have to meet the certain criteria of that particular class ruling for that to apply to. So you can kind of see that kind of continuum of kinds of advice that can be produced by the Commissioner to provide that assistance and certainty to taxpayers, whether more broadly to more narrow to the very specific individual taxpayer.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So someone like BHP would they'd get their tax advisors to apply for a class ruling, say when they spun off S32 or something like that, to work out what the cost base was. And they do that to do the right thing because they're looking after all their shareholders, right? And that's where it comes down to. And it's very common. So if that happens to anyone, you don't need to guess what the cost base is in the allocation. You know, if you're getting an in-specie distribution, as you said, it's all there and ready to go. So they're the ones that are nice and binding on the Commissioner, which is nice. But then there's all these fluffy ones that aren't, that look like they could be, Lizzie, isn't it? That's really what we're talking about. And the flavour of the month for me, and the ones that I really dislike, are the PCG, the Practical Compliance Guides. The PCGs just do my head in.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about what practical compliance guidelines PCGs refer to.
So they're the rules of engagement if you get audited. Okay, so think about that for a while. So if your number comes up, you know, like you've been conscripted, your lucky number comes up and you're getting audited by the ATO, it's the PCG that they apply if it fits your fact pattern and circumstances. And it's just a hard one, isn't it, really? Because they're portrayed as being like a tax ruling and binding on the Commissioner, but they're not. They're just saying, this is what we think. And some of them that come out have this risk framework. And some of them are really bizarre. Say, the first one that came through that I can remember like this is the allocation of professional firms' profit. And that one, I think it was 2021. I think it was around about then. And they said, we're going to put you in, it was traffic lights. We're going to put you in different risk categories. And we're saying, if your fact pattern looks like this and you've done this, you've got low risk. And we won't deploy any more compliance resources if you're in a green zone, all the way up to amber, meaning cautious, and then red saying, we're going to audit you until we find something, so to speak. So these are the things, and my interpretation of PCGs is it's the ATO trying to make law, but they're not, right? So there's some practitioners out there that go, I'm following the PCG, and I'm going, yeah, but it's only the rules of engagement if you audit it, and even if you follow it, you're not protected. It's not binding on the Commissioner like previous tax rulings that we talked about were.
So it's really important to understand that the PCGs are really the internal documentation or internal guidelines for the staff to use when they're looking at taxpayer activity. The usefulness for taxpayers is by having an awareness of what the internal procedures are, is that we can operate externally within essentially the green lights, the swimming flags, so that we know that we're not going to be audited if we're doing X, Y, and Z. So it can be useful to understand, again, that compliance risk comes back to it. But again, it's not the law. You still have to look to what the activities you're doing. If it's an expense that you're looking at, you still need to look at, have you incurred an expense that has the nexus with income earning activities or a carrying on of a business? Does it comply with the provisions? Is there a specifically denying or reducing or limiting provision there? You've got to contemplate all that. And that becomes particularly important as you go through any appeal objection process, because you can't, as you say, rely on the PCG from that point of view. So there's a use for it. It's very helpful, but we've got to be mindful. Again, we're looking at the ATO who administers the law. it's not creating law, although this in a sense mimics a little bit. So often there's that description of LAW law versus LORE law, and it can offer us
And the
some
PCG's
interesting
fitting, yeah.
perspectives.
The PCG's fitting into that sort of realm of LORE, really, for me. And they're starting to issue them. The ATO is starting to issue them a lot for clarity, because we don't get that many tax changes in this country. Tax reform is pretty much non-existent. But as you were talking about the PCGs, that's the rules for an audit. So that's how an ATO auditor will apply to you. But the ATO's also got this other little bit of documentation called the PSLAs, right? The Practice Statement Law Administration. And that's something that we can read, but it's specifically designed, applies to ATO staff. Which is very bizarre. So you've got the PCG of the auditor, how they're going to audit you. And then if there's a PSLA on a similar topic, that's the rules of engagement that the ATO staff have to be, good auditors and things like that with those sort of things. So that's quite interesting. So what we're trying to say in this podcast, I think, Lizzie, is you've got to know what the documentation is, what's it for, and how you rely on it to see if it does give you protection, because that line is getting very blurred between law and law.
Yeah. And the trade-off here is certainty versus uncertainty and ambiguity. So the ATO is in a really solid position to provide assistance, highlight that scope of what compliance should look like in their eyes. But we've got to have that criticality and thinking broadly about what the law actually is as well, particularly if you go on to be a tax practitioner, if you're working in this space, if you're a taxpayer applying it to your own circumstances. It is really important that you understand what the law is and what is the advice or guidance directed and interpreting that law.
Yeah, so, and another one of the ones that we should talk about at the same time interpreting is a decision impact statement. Right, that's another one that's quite interesting, because what decision impact statement is there's a case, Morton versus the Commissioner of Tax or whatever, right? And the ATO probably, if they're doing a DIS, they're probably lost, if I can be so boldly to put that. So they basically say, here is our decision impact statement on how we're going to interpret it for future taxpayers. So if you're going to rely on that case as precedence, this is how we're going to interpret it, right? And that's what a DIS is.
Yeah, and that's important because they'll often have an update, particularly if there's a case still before the courts or it's going on appeal. So they may have, as you've indicated, they may have lost the case, which may mean some of their guidance that is currently published may not be updated to reflect that position. But until the case has gone through all the appeal and exhausted all those avenues, the ATO is well in their rights to remain unchanged in their formal guidance, because there's that process undergoing. There could be disruption, it could be backwards and forwards. So until it's settled, there's some sense to that, although there is controversy in the ATO not changing positions here. But yeah, so you can have a statement coming out that looks to, okay, we understand that this is a position with that case, our guidance says otherwise, we're waiting, we're not changing our position until the case, the appeal process is exhausted, and it might indicate how they're going to deal with the compliance of affected taxpayers in that situation. So we are seeing that from time to time. There's a couple of cases at the moment that fit within that bill, like Bendel, for example, which is a case around trusts. And
there was a good one that came up a lot that some people may be familiar with is Addie's case. Remember, with the backpacker, right? Catherine Addy, the backpacker, and that went through, is she a resident or is she, on a working holiday, make a visa and things like that. So that went through the same sort of thing in their position. So they're the ones that we talk about. And then I think the only other documentation that really comes out is like tax alerts. One's just come out recently again. And that's nudging, I think. That's warning signs. That's telling you what's on the ATO radar. So the ATO can tell you what could be audit activity. Like, if you're doing, rental properties is always a popular one. Okay. Or if you're doing property transactions, GST, is one, just flipping a house, is that should you be registered for GST sort of thing. There's a lot of tax alerts on that as well. And that's just signaling we think this is a hot topic. People are doing a lot of it. And this is our interpretation of how you need to apply the tax for a tax alert. And there's one on property development that's just come out as well. So again, always look at what the heading is, what the code is on it, so we know how it is going to get interpreted and used by the ATO. So that gives us that sense of protection. Because remember, we apply the law based on legislation and case law. This is where the ATO is doing their job of interpreting and telling us how they're going to audit us. If we get a please explain, because we've got a self-assessment tax system, Lizzie, that's how it works.
Yeah, excellent. So do you have any final comment before we wrap up this episode? What is the kind of key takeaway? I think you've kind of already achieved that in what you've flagged.
Yeah, I think that's sort of where I wanted to head to with it. And I think that there's so much information out there now. Always go back and work out what the source is coming from. Okay, and that's what it is. You can easily put it into an LLM, Claude, ChatGPT, Copilot, and get something out that's then referenced something. But just always go through and work out. And the big thing about all this advice and guidance the ATO puts out, it's got to match your fact pattern, Lizzie. If it doesn't match your fact pattern, you cannot rely on it one iota. It's really and that can be used for good and evil, if I can put it that way as well.
No, that's a really good way to wrap it up. No, for sure. So understanding the facts and circumstances about the taxpayer. So that's very much going through to the particular taxpayer and looking at the fact that there is uncertainty, there is complexity, and the ATO does have to bridge essentially what the case law, the legislation principles are to the reality, to an everyday operation, and actually have a means to achieve essentially their role. So they're in a tough position to do that. And so there's a lot of challenges with that. And obviously with that comes controversy.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good point that I need to leave. You can do the follow-up now. You can do the check-up now.
All right. So that's it for this episode of Taxed and Confused, where the rules are rigid, the paperwork is endless, and the burden of proof is all yours. If you enjoyed today's deep dive into tax admin, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who's just as confused as we are. And remember, this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It's not tax advice, and we're not your tax agents. So thanks for listening, and until next time, stay curious, stay compliant, and stay just a little bit taxed and confused.